So I just want to share a few of my thoughts on this terrible news from Sri Lanka. A lot of things I'm going to be saying have already been covered in the news. This is a subject I wanted to talk about, but I've been traveling, so it's been difficult to upload videos over the last few days. Um, the first thing that's obvious is the scale of this attack. About 320 people dead, hundreds injured. I think I'm right in saying the worst terrorist attack in the world, anywhere. Since the Mogadishu bombing in 2017, in which over 500 people died, and that was in an active war zone. Now, the notable thing in this case, obviously, is that whilst Sri Lanka has a very violent history, we all know about the brutal civil war it went through from 1983 to 2009. That did end in 2009. And there's no doubt about it that there are ghosts from that civil war. There are ongoing issues around reconciliation and truth in that country, but and human rights issues. But this appears to have been an Islamist attack with nothing to do with that earlier conflict. Now, apparently, a small group has claimed responsibility. ISIS has claimed responsibility, but they always do. Nevertheless, it seems very likely that because of the scale of the attack, it's being compared to the Mumbai attacks of 2008. It's very plausible that a bigger group like ISIS either bankrolled this, gave training to these jihadists, or something. Um, there's really just a few things I want to say. Number one, it reiterates the fact the persecution of Christians around the world in 2019 is rampant. It's true that hotels were also targeted, but it's very clear that Christians were the target of this attack, particularly at this Easter time. Um, and I must admit, when I heard about it, I thought this is unusual. This isn't Pakistan. This isn't Egypt. This isn't an Islamic majority country. So it struck me as unusual. I thought this is strange. But what the reports are now suggesting is it may be Sri Lankan jihadists who went off to Syria. So there's been a lot of focus on these European jihadists who went to fight in Syria and causing problems when they come back. I think that might be a worldwide problem because they are from every nationality almost. So if this is like a taste of what's to come, that's really chilling. Um, there isn't really much more to say, but I will say this. Even today, infuriatingly, there are people who refuse to accept the obvious that Islamic extremism has something to do with Islam, just as extremism in any religion has something to do with that religion. I cannot tell you how utterly tired I am of people trying to silence debate and silence discussion of this ideology by saying, oh, it's got nothing to do with Islam. And I'm sick and tired of the political correctness of constantly having to say, oh, but we're not talking about all Muslims. Because common sense dictates that people like myself are not doing that. But there's two kinds of people who tend to take this narrative. It's Muslims who don't want to admit that there is a problem in their midst. They just don't want to accept the obvious. They'll constantly say, oh, nothing in the Quran says this. And the stated aim of jihadists, particularly ISIS, is to spread an Islamic caliphate. Now, that is as much connected with Islam as the early Christian crusades were connected with Christianity. No one disputes that the crusades were connected with Christianity. So why is it today, with the spread of pan-Islamism, there are still apologists and deniers who just don't want to admit it? They will condemn the attacks, of course they will, as will most sane people. But as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't mean anything. It just means they want to wipe the hand of the problem in their midst. That doesn't mean they're individually responsible, but they do have a responsibility to be honest. And it's very obvious that they care more about the perception of their faith than actually what extremists are doing in the name of the faith. Now, you could argue it's a distortion of Islam, but what is the true Islam? Islam's a major world religion. It's got as many branches as Christianity, so no one can claim that they alone are the true Muslims. These are very, very serious issues, and I find it infuriating. So anyway, that's one side. The other side, the other group of people who take this narrative is non-Muslims who are virtue signaling, usually of the regressive left. Immediately they will say, "Oh, don't be Islamophobic." It absolutely infuriates me because I think it's moral cowardice. Just ask the average Iranian who's come to the West as a refugee because they're either a Christian or an atheist or an ex-Muslim. That is, a Muslim who's no longer practicing. They're branded apostates and their lives are threatened. So when I see the intolerance done in the name of Islamic theocracy, not just terrorism, but Islamic theocracy, and then I see people try to silence debate, that's why I was so angry with the Liberal Democrats recently over that incident with the candidate where they suspended the candidate for telling the truth. I'll be honest, I contacted their Facebook page and I was very blunt. I didn't threaten anyone. I don't do that. But I was very blunt. I told them what I thought of that position because it's anything but liberal. That's the situation we're in. Too many people still will not be honest. And, it's been said that, I think it might have been Pope Francis made this point actually, that one of the reasons why we don't hear about Christian phobia and there's far too little focus on the persecution of Christians around the world is a false perception of associating Christians and Christianity with the West and with privilege and with wealth in developed countries. The reality is, most of the world's Christians live in developing countries. Most of the world's Christians are not white Westerners. Probably around two-thirds are living in developing countries. So I think that's the reason why there's this taboo from the regressive left around criticizing Islam, but they're absolutely fine with bashing Christianity. And it's a lack of consistency I have no time for. I just feel that we're living in an upside down situation where people cannot tell the truth without, like that candidate. He's not an anti Muslim bigot. He wasn't expressing hatred of all Muslims. He was just stating the obvious about human rights issues, about regressive values, about things that need to be discussed. His party is too cowardly to do that. So they're suspending him. It's a damn disgrace. And then they wonder why the far right rises. The far right rises, and I have no time for the far right. But the reason they rise is because they fill the vacuum. That's the sad reality. So it's a vicious cycle. Brenton Tarrant and those like him are produced by the fact that the polite classes, for want of a better term, the establishment, call it what you will, simply will not be honest about this problem. Only in the last few years have they even bothered saying the words Islamist extremism. Most of the 2000s, they went for the politically correct line, generic terrorism. Until the world wakes up and recognizes that pan-Islamist extremism, which is ideologically based on an extreme interpretation of Islam, until the world wakes up and accepts that fact without towing the politically correct narrative. And even the Pope has done it. I respect Pope Francis. I believe he's a genuinely decent man who genuinely cares about the poor. But even he told the PC line, I believe in one of his addresses, he said that it's wrong to associate violence with Islam. Not when we're talking about violent Islamic extremism. No, Your Holiness, you're wrong. And I respect the man, but I think, I do think as head of the Catholic Church, he needs to be recognising the threat here. That wouldn't be the same as bashing Islam as a whole, just saying that I recognise that Christians are being persecuted around the world, and I recognise that Islamic extremists are doing it. I really have no time for this argument. It's just generic terrorism, the Jeremy Corbyn school of thought, especially when people who talk about terrorism in those terms, apologists and deniers, would have no problem being specific about far right terrorism and being specific about the ideology behind it. Anyway, I'll round this up. It's just, I mean, you expect blasphemy mentality in countries with backward Islamic theocracies like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran. But when we're seeing this increasingly in, when we're seeing political candidates punished by their own party for telling the truth, it's sinister. It's just, it's just wrong. And it is so cowardly and it is so dishonest. And more importantly, that's all bad enough, but more importantly, without addressing the problem, without being honest about the ideology, how can we even begin to tackle it? That is why it's a problem.